10,000 Days of Fire, a compromise that divided a country and the conflict of the Vietnam War. On August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, allowing President Lyndon Johnson to wage military operations in Southeast Asia against the communist forces that were taking root in Vietnam. Although this is considered to be the start of the Vietnam War, the conflict of the Vietnam War can trace its roots to the end of World War II, when France attempted to colonize Vietnam once more after being chased out by the Japanese. America would later fight to protect South Vietnam against an enemy that could strike and quickly vanish into the jungle. The Viet Cong Communists were aided by Communist China and the Soviet Union. After gaining independence from France in 1954, Vietnam was divided into two halves. This was supposed to be temporary, lasting only until the election in 1956, but these elections never took place. After an unsatisfactory compromise that resulted in the division of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh worked to unite the Communist North Vietnam and the anti-Communist South Vietnam. This conflict was known as the Vietnam War and was the longest and most unpopular war in U.S. history. To some, it was a mistake, and to others, it was a noble cause. Vietnam has had a long history of colonialism. It was a colony of China and would later become a colony of France in the late 19th century. Independence would become something highly valued by the Vietnamese. During World War II, Vietnam would be occupied by the Japanese as Japan began the invasion of neighboring countries such as China and Korea. In order to gain the Americans' trust, Vietnam became an ally of America, rescuing downed pilots and providing valuable information on the enemy. In return, America trained them in guerrilla warfare that they could use against the Japanese. After Japan surrendered in August 1945, there was no strong nation left in the area, resulting in a power struggle between the Vietnamese. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh, as the chairman of Vietnam, declared his country independent. The year of 1947 would start a full-scale war between France and the Viet Minh, the Communist Party of Vietnam formed by Ho Chi Minh. Both countries had their allies. Vietnam had China's assistance, and France was aided by the USA. American advisors had been deployed by President Truman and his successor, President Eisenhower, ever since the 1940s and had come to strongly oppose Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh.
The war can be considered by many ways. I think the Vietnam War was the authorization war first, because there are two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US.
The Geneva Conference of 1954 was an international meeting that discussed the fate of France's colonies in Indochina. The meeting involved many countries, including France and representatives from Vietnam, lasting a total of 2 months and 25 days. In that period of time, a compromise between France and Vietnam was reached. Vietnam would gain its independence but be divided at the 17th parallel, an imaginary circle of latitude 17 degrees north of the equator. This compromise would also have national elections under international supervision, held every 2 years. South Vietnam was known as the Republic of Vietnam, with Saigon as its capital. It would be made up of the Vietnamese who did not accept the idea of communism. The North would be known as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with the capital of Hanoi. It would be a communist country led by its chairman, Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese nationalist who imported the doctrine of communism from the Soviet Union and would later work tirelessly to unite Vietnam. His efforts to unite Vietnam would lead to a large conflict in history that would later be known as the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had no official beginning. U.S. involvement started during the end of World War II, when France attempted to regain control of Vietnam, starting the First Indochina War. At that time, President Harry Truman felt that if Vietnam became communist, it would have a domino effect upon the other countries in the area, and would later threaten the USA. At first, he only sent advisors to advise the French, our main ally against the Soviet Union. Dwight David Eisenhower succeeded Truman in 1953 and considered supporting the French troops in Vietnam, but was advised not to do so and avoided getting directly involved. John F. Kennedy became president after Eisenhower and followed his lead by using only limited military action against the communists. Yet the status of America's involvement was changed after Kennedy sent 16,000 military advisors and American special forces into Vietnam. He also allowed the military to use free fire zones, defoliants, napalm, and jet planes in the war. Essentially, Kennedy started the war, although his successor would escalate the conflict. Johnson strongly believed in the domino theory and focused mainly upon winning the war. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a supposed attack on 2 American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin by North Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was made on August 7, 1964. It granted President Johnson the authorization to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war by Congress. Under his administration, the number of soldiers greatly increased. By 1965, there were more than 200,000 soldiers, and by 1969, that number had increased to 543,482. At least 1.5 million were regularly exposed to combat an enemy attack. The main enemy was the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese communist guerrillas. They used the terrain to their advantage, using it as a cover and vanishing into the jungle. They sought to gain the support of the peasants, a task that Mao Zedong had encouraged earlier. The Viet Cong were also known as the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, and did not directly attack the American army unless there was a certain chance of winning. This proved to be a very useful tactic and weakened the resolve of the American soldiers. In 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder was deployed. It would be a series of bombing raids on North Vietnam and last for 3 years. America had hoped for a quick victory, but these hopes were dashed when North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, an attack on South Vietnam that occurred in 1968 and caught the Americans and South Vietnamese off guard. Militarily, it was a huge defeat for the Viet Cong, yet it made many Americans uneasy about the war, because it signified that the war was far from over. Richard Nixon would succeed President Johnson after the former president announced that he would not be a candidate for president. Nixon began the secret bombing of Cambodia in an effort to destroy communist supply routes. It would go on for 14 months without knowledge of Congress or the Senate. During Nixon's presidency, he slowly began the withdrawal of troops in order to end U.S. involvement. The draft ended in 1973 as the last of American troops began to leave Vietnam. As the American troops began to withdraw from South Vietnam, North Vietnam began a series of large-scale offensive military operations against South Vietnam in an attempt to force the government of South Vietnam to surrender. Preceding this event was Operation Frequent Wind, an evacuation of all Americans in Vietnam, along with thousands of South Vietnamese civilians looking to escape communism. This operation was a sign that the American government was losing faith in the war, and that the fall of Saigon would become the inevitable. The mass evacuation of Americans and South Vietnamese by helicopters escalated as the North Vietnamese army attacked Saigon. The attack continued until April 30th, 1975, when Saigon fell to the Communists. The fall of Saigon would mark the end of the Vietnam War.
I did not feel that the reason for us being there was justified. I didn't like communism, but I didn't feel that we needed to wage a war in Southeast Asia to stop it from happening.
The Vietnam War was the result of an unsatisfactory compromise in the eyes of its patriot, Ho Chi Minh, and an example of how a compromise can result in a conflict. The war itself can be viewed as either a noble cause lost or one of the biggest mistakes America ever made. 58,226 American soldiers died in Vietnam. The total number of Vietnamese civilian deaths ranged from 1.5 million to 3 million, although the exact number remains unknown. Because the war was so unpopular at that time, many of its veterans were not given as much respect as those who had fought in previous wars. The Vietnam Veterans War Memorial was built on October 13, 1982 in Washington, D.C., to honor every single soldier who died in the war. Since then, the memorial has been visited by more than 3 million visitors per year and has served to heal the wounds of a conflict and compromise that divided a country in two.